Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Healing the Spirit. I am excited to share with you a different kind of episode than what I usually share on Mondays. If you've been listening to the podcast regularly, you know that on Mondays, usually I share some thoughts, reflections, contemplations about the astrology of the coming week, as well as the energy that I'm sensing into. And in some ways, the spirit of this episode is not far too different from that. I believe that part of my process right now is also inspired by the energy and the astrology, but I want to approach talking about the energy of the week differently. I want to approach it from the lens of sharing where I'm at currently with my process as a human being and as an artist and as a creative person, especially as it pertains to this podcast, because hopefully this is an interesting case study for you. For those of you listening who are also artists, who are also a creative person, or someone who is in touch with your creative spirit, there is so much available, in my opinion, at this time for us to make some changes that maybe we've been feeling for a while or that we've been wanting to try out for a while. And I think part of what can feel scary about that process is the reality that experimentations are inherently messy, right? As I'm sharing this with you, there's a part of me that is freaking out a little bit because it does feel a little bit vulnerable to share the behind the scenes of what's been going on in my life. And in terms of how I approach this podcast, that, it's gotten to a point where I can no longer kind of keep it under wraps. There was a part of me, if you listen to this podcast at the beginning of the year, that knew that something was going to change with the podcast. And the change feels pretty major. I'm not going to lie. And for a while, I really needed to stay steady with the rhythm of what I've established because the change wasn't totally clear for me yet, both on a mundane level, right, logistically, as well as on an energetic level. And the logistics of how the change is going to look is still mysterious to me at this moment, but energetically, I really feel it. And I'm sensing that this is something that a lot of you may experience as well, that you may feel like it's time for you to get the ball rolling, right? What is interesting about change is that change is not just something that happens to us. We are not simply victims of change, right? We are also agents of change. And so if we want to create change, we also have to actively participate. We have to actively engage. And this is what's happening with the podcast right now as we're speaking. And so, yeah, I want to start maybe with talking a little bit more about the spirit of this change. The spirit of this change is really coming from my desire to allow the podcast to start transitioning and becoming a place where I can explicitly and publicly experiment. Experiment with my own process, experiment with the things that I'm learning, experiment with integrating my um, personal life, right? Which sometimes really does not look like thinking about astrology or thinking about spirituality into this work, and to begin to create a body of work that feels more robust and more reflective of who I am as a human being, which is really an ongoing process, right? I think many of us crave that. Many of us crave that integration. And I think what's so exciting about having creative projects is that there's always going to be tension there, right? It's the truth is creative projects are not daily reality. They're just not, right? And I think this is something that um, a lot of artists can get quite stressed about, or maybe even sometimes confused about, right? Because there's a part of us that wants to show up authentically, but there is something about creative projects that isn't that is beyond our own needs and desires and personalities, you know? When we allow ourselves to become the steward and the vessel for creative energies, there's something transpersonal that starts to happen, right? When I'm sharing my thoughts and my reflections through this podcast with you, it's no longer just my thoughts. It's no longer just my ruminations. It becomes something that I'm sharing with all of you, right? That will impact all of you in some shape or form if you are listening. And so, yeah, I think there's something so exciting about that tension. And also, it can feel disorienting sometimes, especially when we're in moments of transition. And so, what I'm hoping to do throughout the summer is to shift this podcast around a little bit. The spirit of it is not really going to change because the contemplations, as well as the conversations, are really formats that spring out of an essential part of my being. I think the reason why I even call them contemplations is because it's so reflective of how it feels for me to look at the astrology and to consider energy. It always feels like a contemplative process for me, even when I'm doing readings for my clients, or even when I'm channeling materials for my students. And yet, what I'm curious about is what happens when I shift the format a little bit, right? What happens if I shift the structures a little bit? As you may know, the weekly contemplations have been very steady since its inception, right? I've mostly shared it on Mondays, right? It really feels like that offering is an offering for the moon itself. There's something about showing up and sharing some of these reflections every single Monday that feels so nourishing, so grounding, and very much, yeah, like regulating to me. But I've been curious about what would happen if I start to maybe share about astrological transits as they're happening, or maybe before they're happening, or maybe after they're happening, right? Because I think there's a way in which, um, especially if you are into astrology and you consume astrological content created by many different creators, you may notice that everybody um, ends up doing the same thing. Everybody ends up creating forecasts, right? Because that's what we've trained our audiences to want, And I think there's a part of me, maybe a more rebellious part of me, or maybe more of an explorer, scientist part of me, that knows for sure that that's not the only way that astrology can be powerful, right? The study and the art of astrology can be really powerful when we start to use it. When we start to explore the different ways that we can use it, right? To me, astrology is both a sentient being, right? Like an entity, and also it's a tool, right? That um, asks us to collaborate with it. And so I'm really curious to see what would happen if, for example, I only talk about transits that I care about, or that is really calling to me, that feels resonant for me to talk about, right? Um, and what would happen if I share some reflections about what happened with transits that just passed. This past week, for example, we had a full moon in Capricorn, and I was really inspired to, maybe create an episode about that. It's something that I think we don't do enough of. We don't do a lot of, looking back with astrology. We don't do a lot of um, talking about astrology as it's happening. And I'm curious, for myself, what will emerge as I allow myself to explore different formats of talking about astrology. I'm also really curious to talk about, some personal shares similar to this episode right now, and maybe more specifically around my creative process. Recently, I got the um, deck of cards. That is the Marina Abramovich method. For those of you who don't know Marina Abramovich, she is this incredible performance artist, and her work is always so like it always pushes the boundaries of what the human body and the human spirit and what art looks like. um, and she has this deck of cards that outlines various practices that she used in order to get herself into the state of mind and into the kind of level of vitality in the body that enabled her to perform her pieces, right? Which tend to be very taxing mentally and physically. So far, I've only really done a couple of these, and yet every single time, my experience with it has been so profound. So I want to create some space to talk about this as well. And I'm also curious about exploring reflections on archetypes and concepts that are not astrological in nature. Some of you may know that I've been deep in my studies of human design. I've been reading the tarot for years, and also I'm an energy worker. And so I'm curious to talk more about it. There's something about how, with the weekly Monday episodes, um, it doesn't leave a lot of space for me to explore these different interests because you know, I don't think that I want to be the kind of person who creates like 5 podcast episodes in a week, right? And so, in order to make more space for me to talk about all these other modalities and other things that I'm really excited about, what I would want to do, I think in the long run, right, maybe starting the fall, is to start creating episodes where I talk about some of these concepts that are not astrological in nature, but that are relevant to us in terms of the astrology that is happening in the moment. So, for example, this coming week, right, we have on Wednesday Venus squaring the nodes. So, what I want to do is to perhaps create, to talk about a concept or an archetype that is not astrological in nature, but that is relevant to that specific archetype. And yeah, I would be really curious to see if those of you listening will find this resonant as well. There's something that I hear consistently from clients and students and listeners who have been tuning in for some time is how timely it is to receive some of the information that comes through the contemplations. And I think there's something about the format, right, that facilitates that, but I'm also just really interested in knowing if that resonance, if that timeliness is still something we can preserve without explicitly talking about the astrology of the coming week. So in a sense, I'm still creating I'm still creating episodes that are supportive for the astrology of the coming week, because in some sense, I truly believe that um, as an astrologer, I've seen this time and time again. We don't really have a choice. We don't really get to um, opt out of the astrology. you know the wisest and the most reckless of us are still living the astrology. That's what's so beautiful and perhaps a little bit terrifying about the art of looking at astrology, that all of us participate in that cosmic dance, right? And so yeah, finally, I think in terms of logistics, maybe the biggest change is I'm deciding to put a pause on the long form conversations that I've been having with my guests. The reason for this, well, first of all, I just want to say that I believe that the conversations I've shared in 2024 so far have been so juicy. They have been so potent. Every single one of them have been so remarkably significant for me in my own personal life. And whenever I listen back to them, I can just feel in my body viscerally how powerful they are. And um, I think part of the decision to pause sharing conversations and recording conversations is because I want to give everybody, myself included, a chance to go back to some of these conversations, and to for all of you to connect with some of my incredible colleagues that I've had on, that have shared their brilliant wisdom and their um, precious time, and also for you to connect, and for me as well, to connect with some of these ideas that we've been exploring through the conversations. These conversations are so rich, and some of them, the past few weeks, I went on a vacation and I actually listened to some of these conversations, and some of them I ended up listening to multiple times, because they're so rich. And every time I hear something different, even for me as the person who recorded the conversation, I come back to them and there's such multidimensionality to them. So I want to give myself and all of you a chance to catch up, to listen to some of the episodes that are maybe calling to you that you haven't um, gotten a chance to listen to. The last four conversations, I really want to give a shout out to my guests, Brynja Magnuson, Xenia Virai, Tanya, Mark, and Nick, and of the Queer Spirit podcast, and Mary Shook, because these four conversations have, whew, like they've really shifted something in me, and I know that that's also the case with all the other conversations that I've recorded this past year. So yeah, I really just want to encourage all of you to go back and listen to some of them, and to really enjoy them. um so I want to talk a little bit about what the what and the why of these changes, right? Like the circumstances surrounding the decision to um, create this change, and um, why it feels important for me to finally allow this change to start taking hold on the podcast. I think that what I'm learning from this particular process is that any change requires us to go through a certain journey of getting to know the change as a companion, as a teacher, and as a crucial component of reality itself. There's something about this particular change that for me has taken a while. There was a part of me that was sensing this change at the beginning of the year and was very impatient to get the change going. I really wanted to see it happen right away, right? But somehow it didn't feel right. It felt like I really needed to stay devoted to the rhythm that I've established for the podcast because I don't know what it was, right? Something within me, or something in the collective energy, or something in the podcast and the spirit of the podcast itself was not quite ready to experience that more radical change, And um, my recent travels have made me realize how deeply I yearn to be a part of this world, um, to integrate a lot of my learnings into daily reality in ways that are more radical, in ways that are much more um, at the forefront, than before. Like I long to deeply look people in the eyes and make real connections. Something that I noticed throughout my travels was how afraid my body was of other people, and I want to allow my spiritual practices to start shifting me, to start orienting towards the world and to walk this earth loving people truly, you know and being curious about people, and to allow my environment to impact me, and to allow myself to impact my environment more deeply. And I think there's something about the act of coming into our spirituality, right? That for a lot of us feels like finding safety, right? This is something that we even talk a lot about in the somatic healing world, right? Finding safety within the body, you know? And I think that finding safety is absolutely crucial. I think it's absolutely the baseline of a lot of the work, um, of cultivating curiosity, of cultivating connection, of cultivating compassion, right? And also, at some point, one also needs to start stretching oneself outside of the boundaries of what feels safe in order to truly make an impact, right? In order to truly um, walk one's path. I think that the other side of spirituality is how uncomfortable it can be, right? And also, just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not resonant, doesn't mean it's not rewarding, doesn't mean it doesn't bring you peace in the long run, right? Doesn't mean that it won't um, pleasantly surprise you, and doesn't mean that it's not going to lead to some beautiful recognition and mirroring from the world outside of you, right? And so there's a part of me that I think yearns to get the ball rolling with this change, because I don't want to have a creative practice and a spiritual practice that is sterile. I'm not saying that regularity is sterile, right? But I did start to find myself orienting towards the podcast and the contemplations from a space of needing to fulfill my own expectations, and maybe even what I imagine to be the expectations of those listening to this podcast. And while I think there's something so beautiful about that regular rhythm, what I was starting to pick up on was that underneath it, I was afraid of letting go of the regularity of that rhythm, because I didn't want those of you listening to not listen anymore. There's a part of me that truly wants to give you something that's useful for you, something that um, makes you feel more deeply connected to your own lives. And for a while, that looked like showing up regularly. And now I'm not saying I'm not going to show up regularly because maybe I will actually show up more often. I don't know, right, what this new rhythm is going to look like. But I was coming into a realization that energetic steadiness actually looks like listening to my intuition, actually looks like being so deeply in touch with my gut response and with what wants to move through me. And its timing feels spiralic to me. It feels flexible. I keep seeing this image of um, the ways that snakes move, right? Like snakes move in kind of the circular motion. And I think there's something about my creative energy that also wants to move in that way. And part of me showing up fully and sharing my gift with all of you here necessitates me to first and foremost listen to that deep serpentine kind of movement in my body. There's also something about the breakneck speed of creating and sharing podcast episodes that has been a double edged sword for me. It's felt so exciting, almost like a flex, for me to share so many podcast episodes and to be so almost like feverishly creating conversations and these contemplations, especially in the past 6 to 9 months. But all of a sudden, during my vacation, I realized that I don't want to move at that speed anymore. I want to start um, playing with this podcast, honestly. A couple weeks ago, um, I opened my Logic Pro, which is the editing software that I use, the recording and editing software that I used. And I found that the recording I had created for the contemplations for, I think it was the week of um, the 10th, half of it wasn't recorded. And so I literally had to sit on the bathroom floor of this hotel that I was staying at. And I started recording into my phone, which I had never done before. And it was so exciting. And there was a part of me that's like, oh my goodness, how many great podcast episodes can I maybe share with all of you if I'm just sharing notes from like when I'm walking around my neighborhood, or when I'm sitting around at a local nearby park, listening to um, what the lake wants me to share with all of you. How exciting for me to bring the outside world into this podcast, and this is really interesting to me as an artist because in my previous life as a musician, I don't think I ever got to this point. I had always oriented towards being really devoted and dedicated to refining my craft and to um, showing up regularly and to almost um, desiring like a certain perfection, that is not human, that is not part of reality, which is primal in nature, right? And so when I started to feel that desire rising within me, I know that I have to change the format of this podcast. And there's a part of me that also suspects that there may be larger changes more than just the format that may be coming. I don't know yet. Again, the logistics of the vision are still kind of eluding me. And I think the guidance that I received in my heart and in my body is that shift will start happening once I start practicing being open and available to becoming an agent of that change. There's something about, um, I've been thinking a lot about the values of novelty, mastery, and adaptability, right? When we think about novelty, maybe we think about the Fool card in the tarot. When we think about mastery, maybe we think about the Emperor card, right? And then when we think about adaptability, there's something about adaptability that feels very much like the Moon card for me. It has to do with looking at the abyss, and um, despite the fear that comes up, allowing the mystery or the abyss to start working its magic on you, which you can never fully know. You can never fully know how the abyss wants to move through you, right? And part of, I think, the cycle of creativity is that, we get to a certain point where we start to, um, when we start to see ourselves in positions or in um, postures of mastery. And that may be really beautiful and really satisfying for a while. But ultimately, mastery without novelty and without adaptability is an ego trip, right? It stops becoming a vessel through which the intelligence of life can move through us. And it starts to become basically like a museum, right? And so I think part of what I'm realizing here is that I need to rock the boat. The regularity of the Monday episodes have felt so grounding to me, and it is very likely that I will return to that um, regular rhythm at some point. But for the summer, I really want to allow experiments and change to move through me and to see what happens, you know? Um, yeah, there's also a part of me that is afraid that without the regular schedule, I will run out of things to say. But um, there's also a part of me that knows that's not true, you know? That it will, as I allow this process to show me what it wants to be, I think there's also um, deep wisdom that will come through. And there's deep wells of creativity that will blossom forth, And so, um, yeah, I want to share all of that because my sense is that many of you listening or drawn to this specific episode are also moving through something very similar in your own process. That you may have a project that you have wanted to shift for a while, maybe a project that you want to um, end, maybe relationships that you want to say goodbye to, and maybe it feels really scary. And I'm right here with you. I hear you. It is scary to shift, right? There's something about our ego, something about our conscious mind that really loves to have that regularity, that wants to know, when am I supposed to show up? How am I supposed to show up? And fears who we will be when we don't know that. But my sense is that when we allow that part of us to relax a little bit, we may start to see inspiration coming in, major inspiration flooding in, and allowing ourselves to um, learn from that experience of kind of being swept into a new direction. You know, there's a point, I often think about this. Usually, when we sense change coming, and I'm not talking about one of those changes that happen dramatically and that has no room for us to kind of there has no wiggle room, right, for us to have a say. I'm talking about the kind of change that's maybe more gradual, that's maybe more collaborative. Often when we feel this coming, um, and we don't allow ourselves to move in that direction, it starts to become an energetic leak. For me, this is something that I started to experience in a very physical way. I started to notice during my vacation how I was feeling burnt out. And it didn't get to a point where it was bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I just was starting to notice how I wasn't excited at the thought of some of my creative projects anymore. And then I realized the reason why this is because I know for a fact that my inspiration wants to move differently than the context or the structure that I've given it space for. And so, what I've decided to do is to change the structure, to change the tone and the orientation a little bit and let myself kind of breathe again, and be in that messiness maybe of experimentation. That also is where the excitement lies, right? So, yeah, it's also very interesting for me to think about burnout because and I wrote this in an Instagram story the other day. I realized that I don't really ever get burned out by doing things that I don't love. That, one way to look at burnout is it's literally the fire of your creativity burning you in such a way that feels unsustainable, right? And that perhaps requires a little bit of tweaking in terms of how to wield that, right? There's something about creativity, about the element of fire that I associate with creativity that isn't comfortable. This is something that my friend Mallory Dowd recently reminded me of. Creativity is not comfortable because fire is not comfortable, right? And so, um, yeah, I think I'm going to end the share there. Hopefully, this has been helpful. If you are a regular listener to the podcast, first of all, thank you so much. And second of all, I am excited to see what the summer of experimentation is going to bring. And yeah, I really highly welcome any thoughts and shares and reflections you may have as we deepen, as we go further into this exploration. I would love to hear, which episodes resonate with you, which feels useful to you, and which ones maybe don't, and um, yeah, yeah. And if any of you are interested or is feeling the call to um, work with me one on one in a session, I would love to do an astrology reading for you, or a divination reading, or a subtle alchemy reading. Recently, um, these subtle alchemy readings that I've been doing have felt really, really powerful and really impactful. And yeah, I would love to see you. My books are open for July and August. All right. Thank you so much. I wish you a beautiful week, and I can't wait to see you again very soon in one of the episodes that's going to come out. It's a surprise for me and hopefully a surprise for you. All right. Sending you so much love, and I hope you take good care of yourselves.